The air in Chicago's O'Hare International Airport was thick with the usual Friday morning rush. Jonathan Adams, a 45-year-old businessman known for unrelenting ambition, wove through the crowd precisely, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit and clutching an expensive leather briefcase. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had long since mastered the art of corporate life. Every step was calculated, and every glance at his gold wristwatch was a reminder of his meticulous nature. Another business trip, he thought wearily as he headed toward his boarding gate. Success clung to him like a second skin, but underneath, there was a void, a hollowness that no amount of wealth, no number of high-stakes deals could fill. He sighed deeply. The weight of his choices heavy on his mind. He had everything most men dreamed of: money, power, and a sprawling estate in the suburbs. But despite it all, something vital had slipped through his fingers, leaving an ache in his chest that he could neither name nor ignore. As he continued his brisk pace, he couldn't help but feel that his meticulously crafted life was missing the one thing that truly mattered. It happened in a split second, just as Jonathan passed a coffee kiosk. A flash of brown hair and soft laughter caught his attention. His breath hitched. The woman who had just walked by with a young boy holding her hand was a ghost from his past. Someone he had long tried to forget, but never entirely succeeded. Emma. Her name whispered itself in his mind like a long-lost secret. His feet froze as his eyes locked on the small boy beside her. He couldn't tear his gaze away. The boy, perhaps 10 years old, had the same striking green eyes Jonathan saw every morning in the mirror. The same unruly blonde hair that had once been his trademark as a child. The boy moved with a confidence that mirrored Jonathan's youthful gait. It was like looking at a reflection of his younger self. Memories surged forward, unbidden and harsh, like a wave crashing against the shore. He remembered a night 10 years ago, slipping quietly out of the apartment he had once shared with Emma, leaving behind nothing but a cold, hastily written letter on the kitchen table. The memory hit him with the force of a punch. He had walked out of her life, out of their life, without looking back until now. Jonathan's legs felt weak beneath him as he struggled to process what he had just seen. Could it be? Was that boy his son? Had he unknowingly abandoned not only Emma, but also a child? His child? Panic welled up inside him, an unfamiliar feeling for a man used to being in control. He started moving, his heart racing, trying to catch up with Emma and the boy. He couldn't let them disappear. Not again. Emma, he called out, his voice barely audible amidst the airport noise. He quickened his pace, pushing through the bustling crowd with a desperation he hadn't felt in years. With its maze of passengers and departure gates, the airport suddenly felt suffocating. He tried to weave through the crowd, but they closed around him like a wall, obstructing his view. Emma, he called again, louder this time, but the constant hum of the airport swallowed his voice. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the crowd frantically. When he reached the spot where he last saw them, they vanished into the sea of travelers. Jonathan stood there, feeling utterly lost, the reality of what he had just witnessed beginning to sink in. Jonathan remained rooted to the spot for a long moment, staring blankly at the crowd. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Another call from Olivia, his current wife, but he ignored it. Nothing mattered now except the truth he had just stumbled upon. He had a son. A son. The thought hammered into his mind, relentless and unforgiving. How had he not known? How had he been so blind, so consumed by ambition, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that Emma might have been pregnant when he left? His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his phone, but instead of returning Olivia's call, he dialed a different number. "Frank," he said, his voice low and urgent when the line connected. "It's Jonathan. I need your help." Frank Monroe was an old friend, a private investigator Jonathan had used before for business dealings. But this time, it was personal, very personal. Jonathan quickly explained the situation, recounting the brief but life-altering encounter at the airport. "I need to find her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to find Emma. And the boy." "Are you sure about this?" Frank asked, his tone cautious. "This could open up a lot of old wounds." "I don't care. Jonathan snapped, then softened his tone. I don't care about the past. I just, I need to know. I need to know if he's my son. There was a long pause on the other end before Frank finally spoke again. All right, I'll see what I can dig up. It might take a few days. Do whatever it takes. Jonathan replied, his voice laced with urgency. Money isn't an issue. As he ended the call, Jonathan felt a surge of emotion, unlike anything he had experienced in years. Guilt, fear, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility swirled inside him. He had run from the past for so long, burying it under layers of success and ambition. But now, the past had found him, and there was no turning back. He had to see Emma. He had to know the truth. Across town, in a modest, sunlit home, Emma Adams, now Emma Morgan, was setting the breakfast table for her son, Daniel. The house was small, but it was filled with warmth. Soft sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the simple, mismatched dishes. Daniel, her 10-year-old son, bounded into the room, his blonde hair tousled from sleep, a grin lighting up his face. Pancakes? He asked excitedly, his green eyes, so much like his father's, gleaming with excitement. Emma smiled, tousling his hair as she set the plate before him. Your favorite, she said gently, her heart swelling with love as she watched him dig into his breakfast. But as she sat at the table, a familiar ache settled in her chest. It had been 10 years since Jonathan had walked out of her life, leaving her to pick up the pieces. She could still remember the cold, detached words in his letter, how her world had crumbled in that moment. In the early years, the pain had been unbearable, pregnant, alone, and heartbroken. She had struggled to make sense of her life. She worked long hours as a schoolteacher, barely making ends meet, but determined to provide for her child. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, wondering how she would ever make it through. But she did. Slowly, painfully, she rebuilt her life. And in time, she met Michael, a kind, gentle man who stepped into the role of father without hesitation. He had been a steady presence in her and Daniel's lives for the past 2 years. He never asked questions about Jonathan, never pushed her to open old wounds. He simply loved them both, quietly and steadfastly. Yet, as she watched Daniel eat his pancakes, the past tugged at her, more so today. After what she thought she had seen at the airport, she could have sworn she saw Jonathan standing in the crowd, his eyes filled with shock and recognition. But it couldn't be, she told herself. Jonathan had moved on long ago. Still, the thought lingered, gnawing at her. She pushed it aside, focusing on Daniel, on the life she had built. Jonathan was gone. He had no place in their lives anymore. Meanwhile, Jonathan sat in his hotel room, staring out at the skyline of Chicago, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy, his boy. Frank had called earlier with the first piece of information. Emma hadn't left Chicago. She lived in the same neighborhood, in a small house near where they once lived. But the news didn't stop there. Jonathan had asked the question he feared the most. Does she have a son? Yes, Frank replied. His name is Daniel. From what I can gather, he's 10 years old, goes to a local school. And Jonathan, she's been raising him alone. Jonathan's heart clenched painfully. It was true. He had a son he had never known, never held, never seen grow. He had been living his life of luxury, oblivious to the fact that he had abandoned not only his wife, but his child. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, almost suffocating in its intensity. But Frank hadn't finished. There's something else you should know. Emma's in a relationship. The guy's name is Michael. They've been together for 2 years, and from what I can tell, he's been a father figure to Daniel. Jealousy flared in Jonathan's chest, sharp and unexpected. He had no right to feel this way or resent a man who had stepped up when he had failed. But the idea of another man raising his son and filling the role that should have been his was almost too much to bear. Thank you, Frank, Jonathan said quietly. Ending the call, he sat silently, his mind churning with guilt, anger, and a strange, desperate hope. He had to see them. He had to see his son, even if it meant confronting the man who had taken his place. It took Jonathan 2 days to muster the courage to drive to Emma's house. When he arrived, he parked across the street and sat in his car. His heart pounding, he felt like an intruder, an outsider peering into a life he had no right to disrupt. From his vantage point, he could see the small swing in the front yard, the bike leaning against the porch. It was a simple, happy life, a world that he had no part in. Then the door opened, and there she was, Emma, as beautiful as he remembered, stepped out of the house, followed by Daniel and Michael. They laughed, their voices carrying across the yard as they walked toward the car. It was a picture of happiness, of family. The sight of it made Jonathan's chest tighten with regret. Without thinking, he opened the car door and stepped out, his feet moving before his mind had fully caught up. "Emma," he called out softly, his voice shaky. Unsure, Emma froze. Her head snapped in his direction, her eyes widening in disbelief. They just stared at each other momentarily, the weight of 10 years hanging between them like a thick fog. "What are you doing here?" Emma demanded, her voice sharp, laced with anger and confusion. She stepped forward, her eyes flashing with mixed emotions, anger, hurt, disbelief. Jonathan stammered, I saw you at the airport, and I had to see you. I had to see him. Daniel, he's my son, isn't he?" Emma's face crumpled, the pain of the past rushing back in a tidal wave. "You don't get to say his name," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't get to come back here after all these years and act like you care." "I didn't know," Jonathan pleaded, stepping closer. "If I had known." "What?" Emma snapped, cutting him off. "You would have stayed? Don't lie to yourself." "Jonathan, you made your choice 10 years ago." Jonathan felt his legs weaken under the weight of her words, the truth of them cutting deep. "I want to make it right," he said softly, desperation leaking into his voice. "Please, just let me see him." Emma's eyes filled with unshed tears. "He has a father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He doesn't need you." Before Jonathan could respond, a car pulled up to the curb. Michael stepped out, his face creased with concern as he saw the tension between Emma and the stranger. "Is everything all right?" Michael asked, his voice calm but protective as he wrapped an arm around Emma's shoulders. Emma stiffened, her gaze never leaving Jonathan. "He's just leaving." Jonathan's heart clenched painfully. He wanted to argue and beg, but before speaking, he saw Daniel coming down the street, backpack slung over his shoulder, oblivious to the tension between the adults. Without another word, Jonathan turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd again. Daniel sensed something was off when he walked into the house that evening. His mom was quieter than usual, and Michael kept glancing at her with concern. They sat down for dinner, but the air was thick with unspoken words. "Mom," Daniel began hesitantly. "What's going on?" Emma looked up, startled out of her thoughts. She forced a smile, but Daniel saw right through it. "Nothing, honey," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Everything's fine." Daniel frowned, his green eyes narrowing. "Is it about my real dad?" he asked bluntly, catching him off guard. Her fork clattered onto her plate, and she stared at him, speechless. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the kitchen clock's ticking. Then, Emma sighed heavily and met her son's gaze. "Yes," she admitted, her voice soft and full of pain. "Your father he's in town." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His father, the man he had only ever heard about in vague, detached stories, the man who had left them. "Why is he here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know, sweetie, I don't know." While Jonathan grappled with a whirlwind of emotions, unaware of how to bridge the gap with Emma and Daniel, his current wife, Olivia, had already begun to sense something was amiss. It had been days since Jonathan had returned her calls. At first, she had brushed it off as another of his intense business ventures. But now, a gnawing suspicion kept her awake at night. Olivia paced her lavish bedroom, her manicured nails clicking against her phone as she scrolled through the messages Jonathan had ignored. She prided herself on control, on the power she held over her life and marriage. But Jonathan's sudden distance threatened to shatter that control. It wasn't long before she decided to take matters into her own hands. With a cold, calculating precision, she dialed the number of a private investigator she had used before. "I need you to find out where my husband is," she said. Her voice clipped. "I want to know everything. Who he's with, what he's doing, and why he's ignoring me." Her mind raced as she ended the call. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she felt it involved Jonathan's past, something he had long refused to discuss. If there were another woman, another family, she would find out, and she wouldn't let Jonathan walk away from her so easily. No, Olivia was not the woman who would sit quietly while her life unraveled. She had built a life of luxury with Jonathan, and if he thought he could trade her for a more Spartan existence, she would show him just how mistaken he was, unaware of Olivia's plotting. Jonathan stood again in front of Emma's modest home on Maple Street. He had been there several times now, watching from afar, trying to summon the courage to face the reality of what he had done. Each time, he had turned away, unsure how to confront the past that had caught up with him. But today was different. Today, he felt a determination that outweighed his fear. He had spent the last 10 years running from his guilt, from the life he had abandoned, from the choices he had made. But he couldn't run anymore. The boy he had seen, Daniel, was his son. He knew it in his bones. And no matter how much he had failed in the past, he had to try to make things right. He took a deep breath and stepped out of his car, deliberately crossing the street. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and Emma stood holding a basket of laundry, her eyes widening in shock when she saw him standing there. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I need to talk to you," he said quickly before she could shut the door. "Please, Emma, I just need a few minutes." Emma hesitated, her eyes flickering with the pain of old wounds. But she stepped aside, allowing him into the small, cozy home that once could have been his. He glanced around, taking in the simple, warm surroundings, the house filled with love and care, starkly contrasting to the cold, pristine mansion he shared with Olivia. They sat down at the kitchen table, the tension thick between them. Jonathan struggled to find the right words that could somehow erase 10 years of abandonment. "I didn't know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I left, I didn't know you were pregnant. If you had." "What?" Emma interrupted, her voice sharp. "You would have stayed? You would have been a father? Don't kid yourself. Jonathan, you made your choice." Jonathan swallowed hard, the weight of her words crushing him. "I know I messed up. I know I can't undo what I did. But I want to try. Daniel, he's my son, isn't he?" Emma looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes," she said quietly. "He's your son. But you don't get to just waltz back into his life now and act like everything's fine. You don't know what we've been through." Jonathan felt the shame rise within him, burning in his chest. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said softly. "I just want a chance to be in his life and make things right. Please." Emma wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "I don't know. Jonathan, he's happy. He has a good, stable life. What if you're coming back just confuses or hurts him?" Jonathan leaned forward, his voice filled with emotion. "I've hurt him enough by not being there. Please, Emma, let me meet him. Just once. I'll walk away if he doesn't want to see me after that. But I need to know my son." Emma stared at him for a long moment, torn between protecting her son and the nagging thought that Daniel deserved to know the truth. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her voice shaky. "But no promises. Jonathan, I have to do what's best for him." Jonathan nodded, relief washing over him, though the road ahead still seemed impossibly long. At least now, there was a sliver of hope. Emma sat Daniel down at the kitchen table the following afternoon, her heart pounding as she prepared for the conversation she had dreaded for so long. "Daniel, there's something important I need to talk to you about," she began, her voice soft but strained. Daniel looked up from his homework, his green eyes, Jonathan's eyes, shining with curiosity. "What is it, Mom?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "It's about your father, she said slowly. Your real father. Daniel's face shifted, confusion knitting his brow. My real dad? I mean, I know he left us. Why are we talking about him now? Emma's heart broke a little at the innocence in his voice. Because he's back in town. He wants to meet you. Daniel blinked, stunned into silence. He stared at her momentarily, his mind racing as he processed the words. He wants to meet me, he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. After all this time? Emma nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I know it's confusing, sweetie, and I'm unsure what to do, but I wanted to give you the choice. If you want to meet him, I'll make it happen. If you don't, that's okay too. Daniel's emotions were a whirlwind: anger, curiosity, fear. He had always wondered about his birth father, who had left before he was even born. Part of him wanted nothing to do with him. But another part, the part that had longed for answers, wanted to know. I don't know, he finally said, his voice small. What if he doesn't care? What if he just leaves again? Emma reached out and took his hand, her voice gentle but firm. I'll make sure that doesn't happen. I'll protect you, no matter what. Daniel nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. Okay, he whispered. I want to meet him. The following evening, Jonathan stood nervously in a small park near Emma's house, waiting for the moment to change his life. His hands trembled as he watched Emma approach, Daniel walking hesitantly beside her. Jonathan's heart raced as he saw the boy up close for the first time, the boy who was his son. Daniel stopped a few feet away, staring at Jonathan with wide, uncertain eyes. Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice shaky as he spoke. Hi, Daniel, he said softly. I'm your father. Daniel didn't speak for long, his gaze flickering with emotions he couldn't yet name. Why did you leave? He finally asked, his voice trembling with hurt and confusion. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, the guilt almost unbearable. I was young, and I was selfish, he admitted, his voice raw with regret. I thought I wanted something else, but I was wrong. Daniel, I was wrong to leave you and your mom, and I'm sorry. Daniel stared at him, his heart torn between the anger of abandonment and the strange pull of curiosity. Are you going to leave again? He asked, his voice small, almost childlike. Jonathan shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. No, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere. I want to be in your life if you'll let me, but I understand if you don't want that. Time seemed to stand still momentarily as father and son faced each other, the weight of 10 years of absence hanging between them. Then, slowly, Daniel nodded, a flicker of something hope, perhaps, appearing in his eyes. Okay, he said quietly. We can try. Jonathan's heart swelled with gratitude and emotion. It was a small step, but it was enough. He felt like he had been given a second chance for the first time in years. The following weeks were filled with tentative steps toward rebuilding what had been broken. Jonathan saw Daniel regularly, at first only in the presence of Emma, then later on their own, trips to the park, ice cream outings, quiet moments of awkward conversation that slowly transformed into genuine connection. Jonathan marveled at how much of himself he saw in Daniel, the boy's quick wit, his love for soccer, and even how he scrunched his nose when thinking. It filled Jonathan with pride and regret, for every slight resemblance reminded him of his missed years. But despite this progress, the shadow of his past loomed large. Olivia, furious over his absence and the discovery of his other life, had taken matters into her own hands. She exposed Jonathan's past business dealings, leaking information about under-the-table contracts, shady investments, and unethical practices. The media descended upon him, and Jonathan's professional empire began to crumble in days. One morning, Emma turned on the television to see Jonathan's face plastered across the news. The headline screaming, "Business magnate Jonathan Adams under investigation for fraud." Her heart sank as she watched, a wave of concern and confusion washing over her. Daniel walked into the room, catching a glimpse of the broadcast. Is Dad in trouble? Daniel asked, his voice tinged with worry. Emma hesitated before answering. Yes, sweetie, she said softly. It looks like he is. Across town, Jonathan sat in his office, staring at the pile of documents before him, proof of the fraud he had spent years trying to hide. He had always known it would catch up with him one day, but he never expected it to happen like this at the very moment when he was trying to make amends with his son. The weight of his guilt was unbearable. He had been a selfish, greedy man, and now, the consequences of those actions were crashing down around him. He picked up the phone and dialed Frank, the private investigator who had become a trusted friend. "It's time," Jonathan said quietly. "I need to confess." Frank paused, his voice filled with concern. "Are you sure about this, Jonathan? It's going to cost you everything." Jonathan nodded, even though Frank couldn't see him. "I've already lost everything that matters. It's time to do the right thing." Jonathan turned himself into the authorities the following day, confessing to years of financial fraud. The media exploded with the news, and within days, he was indicted. His assets were frozen, his businesses dismantled, and he faced the genuine possibility of prison. But Jonathan felt a strange sense of peace for the first time. He had been running from the truth for too long. Now, at least, he could face it head on. When Emma learned about Jonathan's confession, she felt relief and anger and something she hadn't expected: respect. Jonathan had chosen to do the right thing, even though it meant losing everything. She didn't condone what he had done in the past, but this act of accountability made her believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he was changing. Daniel, on the other hand, was devastated. The father he had only just begun to know was now facing jail time. "Why did he do it?" Daniel asked Emma one evening, his voice full of sadness. Emma knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Because sometimes, Daniel, people make mistakes, big ones, but your dad is trying to make things right now, and that's what matters. He loves you." Daniel nodded, though the weight of his father's actions still hung heavy in his heart. The day of Jonathan's sentencing arrived, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, business associates, and even some of his former employees. Jonathan stood before the judge, his face calm but filled with the weight of his choices. He had pled guilty to all charges and was prepared to face the consequences. "Mr. Adams," the judge began, "you've confessed to serious crimes that have affected many people. You've also taken full responsibility, which is commendable. However, the law requires that you face the consequences of your actions. I now sentence you to 2 years in prison, and you are to repay the funds acquired through fraud." Jonathan nodded solemnly, accepting the verdict without protest. As the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, Jonathan glanced at Emma and Daniel, who sat quietly in the back row. Emma met his gaze, her expression unreadable, but Daniel's eyes were filled with tears. Later that day, as Jonathan prepared to leave the courthouse in handcuffs, Daniel ran up to him, his small face etched with determination. "I'll visit you," Daniel said, his voice trembling but strong. "I'll visit you in prison." Jonathan's heart broke at seeing his son, but he managed a small smile. "I'd like that," he whispered. Over the next 2 years, Jonathan served his time in prison, using every opportunity to rebuild himself from the inside out. He enrolled in classes focusing on business ethics and was determined never to repeat his past mistakes. His relationship with Daniel, though strained at times, slowly deepened. During visits, they talk about life, soccer, and school. Jonathan found himself earning back more of his son's trust with every visit. Outside the prison walls, Emma and Daniel continued to build their lives. Emma and Michael's relationship grew stronger as they worked together to provide a stable home for Daniel. And though Emma struggled with the complexity of her feelings for Jonathan, she couldn't deny that he had changed. He was no longer the man who had abandoned her 10 years ago. He was a man who had faced his demons and fought to make amends. Jonathan returned to a changed world when he was finally released from prison. He no longer had the wealth and power he once wielded, but he had something far more valuable: a second chance at being a father. On a sunny afternoon, Jonathan stood beside Emma and Michael at Daniel's soccer game, watching with pride as his son sprinted across the field. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt a sense of peace, a deep, abiding gratitude for the second chance he had been given. As Daniel scored the winning goal and ran toward the sidelines, Jonathan, Emma, and Michael exchanged smiles, a silent understanding passing between them. The road ahead would not be easy. There was still much to heal, much to rebuild. But for the first time in a decade, Jonathan felt he was exactly where he needed to be. That night, as Jonathan walked home to his modest apartment, the city lights twinkling in the distance, he made a silent promise to himself to live each day with integrity, compassion, and love. He had lost a fortune, but in doing so, he had gained something far more precious: his son, his family, and the chance to be a better man. In this emotional story of redemption, Jonathan Adams' journey shows us the profound consequences of our choices and the heavy weight of regret that can linger for years. After abandoning his wife Emma and their unborn child, Jonathan's ambition drove him into a life of wealth, power, and hollow success. Yet, as fate brings him back to face the family he left behind, he is forced to confront the actual cost of his actions. We witness a powerful transformation through Jonathan's sincere efforts to make amends with his son Daniel and his eventual acceptance of the legal and personal consequences. His confession of financial fraud, the loss of his fortune, and his time in prison all serve as stepping stones toward his redemption. Though Jonathan cannot undo the past, he discovers that it is never too late to try and rebuild what has been broken. His newfound relationship with Daniel and the support from Emma and her new partner, Michael, symbolize hope, forgiveness, and the healing power of second chances. If Jonathan's story moved you, consider how today's choices affect those we love. No matter how deep the mistakes are, seeking redemption and striving to improve is never too late. If you're inspired by stories of forgiveness, healing, and personal growth, subscribe to Healing Story 66. Join us as we continue to share heartfelt stories that touch the soul and remind us of the power of love, resilience, and the possibility of change. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Healing Story 66, and share it with your friends. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Jonathan's journey. Have you experienced a moment where you sought or granted forgiveness? We'd love to hear your stories. And together, we can continue to bring stories that inspire hope and healing.